In the late spring of 1971, 25-year-old Nora Blythe walked the fence line of the farm that was now hers, a legacy of soil and silence left by a father who had spoken more to the earth than he ever had to people. The Kentucky air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and damp earth, a familiar comfort that was, on this day, being soured by something else. A sharp, chemical tang, acrid and unwelcome, caught in the back of her throat. It was the smell of industry, the smell of the Corbin Tannery that bordered her western pasture, a place her father had tolerated with the same grim patience he reserved for drought and flood. But this was different. As she rounded a copse of birch trees that marked the edge of her property, she saw it. A sprawling, ugly stain upon the green landscape. It was a field of refuse, a chaotic scattering of hundreds upon hundreds of leather scraps, dumped unceremoniously from the tannery's fence line and bleeding 20 yards into her pasture. They were in every shape and size imaginable, long serpentine strips, thick, misshapen hunks from the shoulder and belly of the hides, brittle, curled pieces that looked like autumn leaves left too long in the sun. The sight of it was a physical blow. It was not just trash, it was a declaration, a statement that this land, her land, was considered nothing more than a convenient landfill. Let me tell you something about inheritance. It is never just about the assets. It is about the weight of memory, the unspoken contracts between generations. Nora's father had been a man of profound respect for the ground beneath his feet. He believed the land was not something you owned, but something you were given stewardship over. He patched his own tools, saved every nail, and saw waste as a moral failing. To see this casual desecration of his life's work ignited a cold, quiet fury in his daughter. This wasn't just an environmental issue. It was a deep and personal insult. The next morning, she put on her cleanest work shirt, tied her hair back severely, and drove her father's old pickup truck to the front gate of the Corbin Tannery. The place was a fortress of corrugated metal and belching smokestacks, run by a man named Arthur Corbin, whose family had owned it for 3 generations. He was a man who saw the world in terms of inputs and outputs, profit and loss, and he had long since written off the Blythe farm as a negligible variable in his calculations. Nora was shown into a small, wood-paneled office that smelled of stale cigar smoke and ammonia. Arthur Corbin sat behind a large desk, a heavy man, with a face that seemed permanently set in a look of mild irritation. He listened to her complaint without making eye contact, fiddling with a pen. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in protest. "Miss Blythe," he said, his voice a low rumble of condescension. "Those are offcuts. Scraps. They're worthless. We're doing you a favor, filling in that low spot for you." Nora's hands, resting in her lap, curled into fists. "They are on my property, Mr. Corbin, and they are leaching chemicals into my pasture. I want them removed." He finally looked at her then, a dismissive glance that took in her youth, her gender, her plain clothes. He saw a problem to be swatted away, not a landowner to be respected. "Listen, girl, my father dumped scraps there when your father was running that place, and he never said a word. It's tradition. You got a problem with tradition?" He smirked, a cruel little twist of his lips. "It's just trash. It'll rot down eventually. Now, if that's all, I have a business to run." He turned his attention back to the papers on his desk, a clear and final dismissal. The humiliation was a hot brand on her cheek as she walked out of that office. He had not just ignored her, he had erased her, reducing her to a foolish girl playing at being a farmer. Now, let me explain the world as it was in that part of Kentucky in 1971. A man like Arthur Corbin held all the cards. He was an employer, a pillar of the local business community. A young woman who had just inherited a modest farm was, by comparison, a ghost. She had no standing, no leverage. The law might have been on her side in theory, but in practice, a fight would mean lawyers she couldn't afford and a protracted battle against a man who could starve her out without a second thought. The conventional wisdom was to swallow your pride, accept the way things were, and try to survive. The neighbors, good people in their own way, would have advised her to let it go. "Don't stir up trouble with Corbin," they would have said. "He's a hard man." But Nora Blythe was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that the most important battles are fought not with loud words, but with quiet, relentless work. She drove home from the tannery not defeated, but changed. The cold fury had cooled into something harder, something more durable: resolve. That afternoon, she did not go to the county clerk or a lawyer's office. She went to the barn. The barn was her father's sanctuary, and now it was hers. It smelled of hay and oil and old wood, a scent that was the complete opposite of Corbin's office. In a heavy wooden chest in the corner, beneath dusty horse blankets, were her father's leatherworking tools. They were not fancy, but they were immaculate. He had used them to repair his own harnesses, his boots, the belts on his machinery. He believed that a man who couldn't fix what he owned was not truly a master of his own life. She laid them out on the workbench: a razor-sharp skiving knife for thinning edges, a set of awls with polished wooden handles, a stitching pony that held the leather fast while you worked, its wooden jaws worn smooth by years of use. There were needles of different sizes, thick spools of waxed linen thread, and various edgers and creasers. To most, it would have looked like an archaic collection of implements. To Nora, it was a tangible legacy. It was the physical manifestation of her father's philosophy, that with patience and the right knowledge, you could make something strong and useful from simple materials. You could be self-reliant. You could mend what was broken. She picked up a stitching awl, its handle fitting perfectly into her palm, a custom-made extension of a worker's hand. In that moment, holding that tool, she felt closer to her father than she had since his funeral. And she knew what she had to do. She would not fight Arthur Corbin on his terms. She would fight him on hers. She would not try to force him to remove the trash. She would use it. She put on her father's old work gloves and a pair of sturdy boots and walked back out to the pasture, this time with a burlap sack. She was no longer looking at a field of refuse. She was looking at a pile of raw materials. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever looked at something everyone else has dismissed as worthless and seen a hidden potential? A discarded piece of furniture, a forgotten skill, an overlooked person? That is a rare kind of vision. It is the vision of the creator, the restorer, the artist. And on that day, Nora Blythe began to see. She began to pick through the scraps. At first, she was just gathering, feeling the different textures and thicknesses. Some pieces were stiff and dry, others surprisingly supple. She filled the sack and hauled it back to the barn. There, under the single hanging light bulb, she started her education. She took a bucket of water and a soft cloth and began to clean the first piece, a wide, crescent-shaped offcut caked in dirt. As the grime washed away, something remarkable was revealed. The leather beneath was a deep, rich brown, its surface showing the beautiful, tight grain of a full-grain hide. This was not the cheap, paper-thin, genuine leather that was becoming common in stores. This was the real thing. It was thick, durable, and possessed a character that only came from the best part of the animal and a proper tanning process. Let me tell you the secret she uncovered that night, the piece of knowledge that Arthur Corbin, in his industrial arrogance, had either forgotten or never cared to learn. A tannery that produces leather for mass-market goods, like shoes or cheap handbags, prizes uniformity. They use the large, consistent center cuts of the hide, the bend. The machines are calibrated for it. The patterns are designed for it. The irregular, tougher, and often higher quality sections, the shoulder, the belly, the neck, are considered waste. They are difficult to cut uniformly, they have more character in the grain, and they slow down the production line. To a man like Corbin, obsessed with volume and efficiency, these pieces were a costly nuisance. To a craftsman, they were the prize. She realized he was throwing away leather that was, in terms of sheer durability and quality, far superior to the finished products he was selling. He wasn't just dumping trash on her land, he was dumping treasure. That realization was the turning point. It was the quiet, solitary eureka that changed everything. Her mission was no longer about simple defiance. It was about reclamation. It was about honoring the material that Corbin had dishonored. The subsequent years were a masterclass in patience and solitary discipline. Nora Blythe became a student of a forgotten craft. She found old books at the library, books with faded diagrams on saddle stitching, a technique using 2 needles that created a lock stitch far stronger than any sewing machine could produce. She learned to cut straps with a steady hand, to bevel and burnish the edges until they were smooth and sealed against moisture. Her first projects were clumsy. The stitches were uneven, the cuts not perfectly straight. She made a pair of work gloves for herself. They were ugly, but they were tough. They didn't fall apart after a month of mending fences like the store-bought ones did. They molded to her hands. They became a second skin. The work was hard. Her hands, already calloused from farm work, grew tougher still. They were often cut, sore, and stained. She worked by the light of the barn lamp late into the night. The world shrunk down to the piece of leather in front of her, the rhythmic pull and push of the needles her only company. The whispers started in the community, of course. People saw her out in the pasture, gathering the Tannery's refuse. They saw the light burning in her barn at all hours. "Poor Nora," they'd say at the feed store. The grief took her mind. They saw a woman obsessed with garbage. They couldn't see the alchemy she was performing, turning waste into worth. They saw her isolation as a tragedy, not as the necessary cocoon for her transformation. There was a moment of private doubt. It came in the dead of her second winter of this work. A brutal cold snap had frozen the pipes, her truck wouldn't start, and she had spent the day hauling buckets of water to the livestock, her fingers numb inside her own handmade gloves. That night, sitting in the cold barn, the smell of leather thick around her, she looked at her raw, aching hands and a wave of despair washed over her. Corbin was warm in his house. The world was moving on, buying cheap, disposable things, and here she was, alone in a barn, trying to salvage scraps. Was he right? Was this just a foolish, prideful crusade? Was she wasting her life on trash? She was so close to giving up, to just letting the leather rot in the field and focusing on the farm. But then her eyes fell upon her father's stitching pony. She saw the deep grooves in the wood, worn down by his hands, by his patience. He had never taken the easy way. He had faced drought, debt, and loneliness, and he had simply woken up the next day and continued the work. Her doubt did not vanish in a blaze of glory. It was simply pushed aside by the quiet, stubborn need to continue. She picked up her needles and went back to it. That was the Blythe way. The first sign of success was small and unannounced. An old farmer named Jedediah, a man who had known her father, stopped by one afternoon. His best horse harness, a pre-war model made of thick, oiled leather, had finally given way. The new one he'd bought at the supply store was a flimsy thing of thin leather and cheap rivets. He'd heard the talk about Nora. He was skeptical, but he was also a practical man running out of options. "Heard you're tinkering with leather, Nora," he said, holding up the broken strap. "Reckon you could fix this proper?" Nora didn't say much. She simply took the strap, examined the break, and told him to come back in 2 days. She didn't just patch it. She replaced the entire broken section with a piece of the tannery's best shoulder hide, stitching it with her practiced, steady hands. When Jedediah returned, he ran his thumb over the new strap. He tested the stitches. He bent the leather, feeling its supple strength. A slow look of astonishment spread across his face. "Lord Almighty, girl," he breathed. "They don't make it like this anymore." He insisted on paying her $10, a significant sum at the time, and far more than she asked for. He left her barn not just with a repaired harness, but as her first true customer and her most important advocate. Jedediah was a man of few words, but the words he used carried weight. At the Grange Hall, at the feed store, at the weekly livestock market, he would tell the story. He'd show off the repair. Other farmers, men who were tired of paying good money for gear that fell apart in a single season, started to listen. They were a frugal, practical people. They understood quality when they saw it. A trickle of customers began to find its way down Nora's long gravel driveway. First, it was for repairs. Then, they started asking for new items. A tool belt that wouldn't sag. An apron for the blacksmith that could turn away a hot spark. A pair of gloves that could handle barbed wire. For each one, Nora chose the perfect piece of leather from her growing, sorted collection in the barn. She used the thick, tough shoulder hide for straps, the more flexible belly leather for bags and pouches. She learned the personality of the material. The land, it seemed, was providing for her in a way she never expected. The tannery's poison was becoming her cure. Demand grew quietly and steadily by word of mouth alone. She never advertised. Her reputation was built one satisfied customer at a time. The farmers who bought from her understood the contract they were entering into. Her gear was not cheap, and it was not fast. But it was an investment. It was something that would last a lifetime, maybe even be passed down. The pile of scraps in her pasture, once a symbol of disrespect, was now her supply house. Arthur Corbin continued to dump his worthless offcuts, unknowingly fueling the growth of the very business that was a quiet rebuke to his entire philosophy of cheapness and speed. The dramatic irony was a secret Nora kept to herself, a small, satisfying smile she allowed herself late at night in the barn. Then in 1978, a writer for a regional farming magazine called The Modern Homesteader caught wind of the story. He was a young man fascinated by the revival of traditional crafts, and the tale of a woman turning industrial waste into premium goods was irresistible. He drove out to the farm and spent 2 days with Nora. He photographed her in the barn, her strong, capable hands at work. He photographed her father's tools. He photographed the finished products, highlighting the meticulous stitching and the quality of the leather. And he photographed the sprawling field of scraps in the pasture, with the tannery's smokestacks looming in the background. The article was titled, "The Blythe Legacy, One Woman's Refusal to Waste." The magazine story was the spark that lit the fire. The article was shared from farm to farm, state to state. Suddenly, Nora's quiet local business was no longer local. The phone, a device she rarely used, began to ring off the hook. Letters started arriving, not just from Kentucky, but from Ohio, Tennessee, Virginia, and beyond. They came with checks and money orders enclosed, with scrawled requests for 2 pairs of gloves, for a custom rifle scabbard, for a set of saddlebags. The demand was overwhelming. She had to hire a local woman to help with the cutting, and then another to manage the shipping. The barn was expanded, a proper workshop built onto the side. The Blythe farm was no longer just a farm. It was the home of Blythe Leather Works, a name that was quickly becoming synonymous with uncompromising quality. And what of Arthur Corbin? He saw the magazine. He saw the pictures of his own tannery's waste being celebrated as the raw material for a famous artisan. He saw the woman he had dismissed as a foolish girl being hailed as a visionary. Business at the tannery was not what it once was. Cheaper imports were flooding the market, and his focus on low-margin, high-volume contracts was leaving him vulnerable. He was a man watching the world change around him, and for the first time, he was on the losing end of that change. One autumn afternoon, nearly a decade after their first and only meeting, Nora saw a car coming down her driveway. It was Arthur Corbin. He did not park by the house. He parked by the new workshop and got out. He looked older, smaller than she remembered. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a weary uncertainty. He stood for a moment, looking at the bustling workshop, at the stacks of finished goods waiting to be shipped. He was standing on her ground now. The power dynamic had been completely and irrevocably inverted. She met him at the door, wiping her hands on her leather apron. She said nothing. She simply waited. "Miss Blythe," he began, his voice lacking its former boom. "I saw the article." He gestured vaguely toward the pasture. "That leather. Our offcuts." He trailed off, searching for the right words. Finally, he looked her in the eye. "How did you know?" he asked. It was the question she had been waiting 10 years to hear. How did you know it was worth anything? Nora allowed herself a small, direct smile. It was not a smile of triumph, but of simple, hard-won truth. "You see offcuts, Mr. Corbin," she said, her voice calm and steady. "My father taught me to see material. He taught me that nothing is worthless if you have the patience and the skill to find its purpose." He nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson he should have learned a lifetime ago. The tannery. "We would like to propose a formal arrangement," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "To supply you with the offcuts. We could sort them for you, deliver them." This was the moment of complete vindication. He was now asking to sell her the very thing he had once forced upon her as garbage. And Nora Blythe, the quiet master of her own domain, set her terms. She named her price per pound, a price that reflected the true value of the material. She specified the quality she would accept and what she would reject. She dictated the delivery schedule. She held all the power, and she wielded it with the same quiet, firm precision she used on her leather. Arthur Corbin agreed to every single condition. He had no choice. He shook her hand, the hand of the woman he had once called girl, and walked back to his car, a man who had finally understood the true cost of his own ignorance. Let me tell you how the story ends, or rather, how it continues. The narrative jumped forward decades. Nora Blythe never became a titan of industry. That was never her goal. She became something far more valuable, a respected elder, a keeper of a craft. The farm thrived, her business providing a stable, debt-free life. The workshop became a place of learning, where she taught the next generation, including her own grandchildren, the skills her father had given her. She showed them how to feel the leather, to read its grain, to make a stitch that would hold for 100 years. The physical artifact of her father's wisdom, his old, worn tools, were still in use. Now, in the hands of a third generation, they were treated not as antiques, but as sacred objects. The legacy of her work was not just in the products she sold, but in the lesson she embodied. Arthur Corbin had looked at her land and seen a dump. Nora looked at his waste and saw a foundation. He had believed in disposal. She believed in restoration. In the end, his business was sold off to a larger conglomerate, and the old tannery was eventually shut down, a relic of a bygone era of short-sightedness. But Blythe Leather Works endured, a small, shining testament to the enduring power of patience, knowledge, and integrity. The dealer said her inheritance was being spoiled by trash. She kept the farm, she used the trash, and the land, in its own way, remembered and rewarded her for it. She had turned an act of disrespect into a life of dignity, proving that the truest wealth is not in what you can buy and sell, but in what you can salvage, what you can create, and what you can refuse to let be wasted.